So welcome to you all. Many thanks for joining this webinar on the future avenues for science advice in the UN system, which is co-organized by the International Science Council, ISC, and University College London's Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy, UCL STEaPP for short. We here have on the call a combination of researchers and diplomats from many backgrounds in the audience, which should lead to a really interesting discussion between different fields and practices. So my name is Arthur Peterson. I'm a professor at STEaPP, and I will be your moderator for today. But let me first invite Dr. Salvatore Arrigo, the CEO of the ISC, to provide some opening remarks. Please, Dr. Arrigo.
Thank you very much, Professor Peterson, Arthur, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm extremely honored by the opportunity of this collaboration with the University College London and to address the opportunity to address member states of the United Nations in relation to the practice of science advice and how this can assist discussions and deliberations within the UN. Based on my experience and the work of the International Science Council at the interface of science with policy, we do benefit from a whole body of literature describing how science advice unfolds. But we also need to take into account the reality of diplomacy and of negotiations and how science advice unfolds in practice versus a purely academic analysis of how science advice is put together and delivered. And this is really what this report, coordinated by UCL in collaboration with the ISC, is all about. The science policy interface has evolved over the years and delivered in multiple areas, from climate change to biodiversity, areas beyond national jurisdiction. Often science advice has provided elucidated the issues related to the global commons, but also in the social sciences area in relation to inequality access. But what is of relevance to our discussion today is that mechanisms that have supported the delivery of science advice to the UN have evolved over time, and until now there has not been a systematic mechanism to ensure that crucial function. So, for example, the United Nations University, which is a think tank within the UN, used to play that function for a number of years and has now moved on to other priorities. There are a number of scientific assessments that have been carried out and continue unfolding, but to the point that there has been a proposal a few years ago about an assessment of assessments. And yet those very models, those different models of various models of science advice have not sort of encountered the favor of member states, to the point that member states have decided that this is the model that we want to deliver the advice that we need. So the report advocates, and I'm not going to anticipate some of its findings, but let me just stress this notion of a more centralized, dedicated, relevant, timely, salient, and cogent advice mechanism. And of course, there are multiple mechanisms already present, and the first step would be really to make sense of all of those and have them come together. But let me just stress here the question of context dependency of science advice, in the sense that even with such a integrated, centralized mechanism, we would still be faced with the difficulty, the challenge of delivering science advice that really makes sense when it comes to specific contexts, be those in relation to cultural aspects or socioeconomic priorities or national agendas, versus science advice on issues of global relevance that really require coordinated action. So that challenge can be tackled through a mechanism for science advice at the level of the General Assembly that takes into account the plurality of views, the multiplicity of epistemologies, and therefore a mechanism that be also transdisciplinary in nature. And indeed, the report also refers to the importance of science advice reflective of multi-stakeholder, of dialogues among multiple stakeholders, ultimately delivered to policymakers for them to then discuss and deliberate on that basis. So to conclude, science and policy making should be free and independent from each other, but at the same time they can go hand in hand and in a synergistic way, so that knowledge is translated into action, and policy is informed by that knowledge. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Dr. Arico, for your kind introduction and emphasis on the importance of context. Before we will receive your presentation on the new research on science advice and to UN General Assembly, the subtitle of this webinar, Dr. Jean-Christophe Mauduit and I would like to provide a brief introduction to UCL STEaPP's work on science advice in multilateral settings. I joined STEaPP over a decade ago as a professor of science, technology, and public policy after an initial career as science advisor in the Dutch government, having performed studies on dealing with uncertainty at Science Policy Interface and having had a governing and reflecting role with respect to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is just one of the existing mechanisms for science advice in the UN system. Presently, I'm back part-time in the Dutch government as the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Dutch Delta Commissioner, a very specific context. The university department that we work in, STEaPP, has from the start engaged in studies of science advice and studies of science diplomacy. And in the MPA Students Group Project and today's webinar, those two streams of activities are coming together. And I would now like to ask Dr. Mauduit to say a little bit more about this.
Thank you, Arthur. So dear colleagues, dear guests, my name is J.C. Mauduit. I'm an associate professor at UCL STEaPP as well, where I focus on science diplomacy, education, and research, together with staff at STEaPP, including Professor Peterson. We research issues ranging from the strategies of states in science diplomacy and human capacity, such as science attaché networks, for example, all the way to the use of science in negotiations and in multilateral settings. I'm also the department lead for our flagship program, which is a one-year Master of Public Administration, which centers around science policy issues and focuses on different themes from digital technologies and policies to climate innovation and sustainability policy, amongst other features that we have on the program. We also have optional modules, including science advice, including science diplomacy, and we're launching this fall an online MSc program, which also contains science diplomacy as a mandatory module. Let me give you a little bit of context regarding the research that our graduates, Olivia and Benedict, will present shortly. In the second part of their one-year Master of Public Administration, the students work with an external partner organization on a policy challenge under the supervision of one or more research staff. And last year, one of our groups of students had the privilege to work with the International Science Council on the topic of science advice at the UNGA. And Arthur and I were supervising this work, and we're very grateful to the ISC for offering this opportunity to our students. We're also very grateful for our students who have now graduated and are fully employed, who have done such great work, and who have continued to collaborate and work with us and the ISC on this important topic well after the end of their master's program and remained very much engaged. So I greatly look forward to their presentation and to the panel, and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maudoui. So we're now ready to hear from the researchers. They will give a 10-minute presentation, after which we will have a panel discussion. And I will introduce the speakers before the panel. We will also open up to general Q&A for the final part of the webinar. And for gathering your questions, we will be using the chat functionality in Teams. So please, when we have started the panel, 10 minutes from now, start entering your questions in the chat, and we will then select some of those for putting forward to panel members for responses. So let me introduce the two STEaPP graduates who will be presenting the research. That's Olivia McDonald and Benedict Schmidt. Ms. McDonald is working in carbon markets on the policy team at Silvera, a prominent carbon data company, and there she's continuing to work in UN spheres through Silvera and UNDP's Carbon Access Data Partnership. Mr. Schmidt is Vice President of the Science Policy think tank, REACH, and works in higher education and research consulting. We're very proud of these two graduates. They have conducted their research on science advice at the UNGA and will now present the results. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Arthur. I will share my screen. All right, a very warm welcome also from our side. It's a huge pleasure to see that our research has sparked so much interest, and I will now, together with my colleague Olivia, present some more details about our research. So we will first talk about the objectives and the methodology, before then jumping to the results about the landscape of science advice at the UNGA, strengths, weaknesses, and potential alternatives, before concluding with a few recommendations. The aim of this research was mainly threefold. First, we wanted to analyze existing UNGA science advice mechanisms. Then we wanted to identify challenges and opportunities that are associated with them, and ultimately explore recommendations and alternatives. In terms of methodology, we started with initial scoping activities to get an overview. Then we did a rapid literature review, and based on those two things, we conducted 16 semi-structured qualitative interviews. Among our interviewees, we had people from the demand and supply sides of science advice at the UNGA, but also people from UN staff and academia. Now over to you, Olivia.
Benedict. So first, let's start by defining some key concepts, many of which you here already take part in your everyday life. So starting with the Science Policy Interface, or the SPI, this represents the junction of science and policy where evidence producers and users interact to inform policy. It's a large web of relationships that covers many different layers of decision-making and research topics, so it's impossible to cover all corners of it. Therefore, policymakers rely on science advice mechanisms, or SAMs, instead to manage this flow of evidence. A SAM is an official institutional arrangement connecting certain evidence producers and users to facilitate the provision of science advice. Fundamental differences between science and policy obstruct a smooth exchange of evidence, in particular regarding timing and specialized expertise. And this disjunction, a tricky word for me apparently, between the two groups towards communication and the use of evidence in policymaking, since neither side has the time to learn the mutual skills needed to communicate with one another, opening a gap that can be filled by knowledge brokers, which are organizations or individuals with the skills and connections in both science and policy to connect the right people to the right evidence at the right time. These players are often part of a SAM and support the co-production of policy, in which evidence producers and users collaborate across the policy-making cycle. Now, Benedict will explain a bit more about the UNGA context in part 2.
So obviously the UNGA is a political body and thus is mainly dominated by national interests. In parallel, also global north-south dynamics play an important role, and the UNGA is, of course, characterized by extensive procedures. These are a few of the aspects that create some challenges for science advice. Fundamentally, there's a question around what role there actually is for science in the whole process, and the same also for the role of stakeholders. Then there is questions around the types and origin of evidence, and maybe even more fundamentally about the questions that should even be asked at the start of an evidence gathering process. So political acceptance of science advice requires measures throughout the process, and in some way, scientific accuracy needs to be balanced with legitimacy. Now let's focus on the current landscape of science advice around the UNGA. The channels of evidence provision to the UNGA can be categorized in mainly four different parts. Of course, there is the UN ecosystem with a huge diversity of channels, including its specialized agencies, intergovernmental platforms, or also established channels like the HLPF, the TFM, and a few more. Then there are the member states with their own national science policy interfaces and research capacities. And these are the preferred sources of evidence for the member states. Apart from those two, we have a few partnerships and networks that engage around evidence provision, and also a considerable amount of ad hoc arrangements. And those ad hoc arrangements are often characterized by informality. You can see that there is some diversity of evidence channels around the UNGA, but still it seems like an institutionalized, systematic mechanism is kind of missing. It is important to highlight that there are crucial strengths of the UNGA and the system of evidence provision. First of all, of course, there is the global legitimacy, which the UNGA possesses, but also it has access to a very diverse knowledge base. At the same time, capacity constraints hinder the uptake of evidence and the engagement. And also, as you saw on the previous slide, there seems to be some fragmentation across the UN system. So in terms of opportunities, we would like to dive a bit deeper into the option of institutionalizing a science advice mechanism, while of course always keeping in mind that geopolitical tensions will persist. Now back to Olivia.
Thanks, Benedict. So having a view of the strengths and weaknesses of evidence provision at the UNGA, we asked interviewees to describe an ideal solution to improve the incorporation of evidence in decision-making. Most interviewees called for an institutionalized SAM, meaning that a dedicated body with a formal mandate and work program would support the systemic integration of science advice in policymaking processes. Here we have the desirable characteristics of an institutionalized SAM as explicitly described by interviewees. Many of these characteristics are validated in the literature as well. These include a clear mandate, co-production, transdisciplinarity, adaptability, independence, effective advice, and knowledge brokerage, which I previously described. But moving on, of course, there are some pros and cons to this option. The advantages of institutionalizing a SAM at the UNGA include enhanced dialogue between evidence producers and users, which would foster co-production, encouraged investment in science advice capacity, bolstering both national SPIs and UNGA mechanisms, equitable access for all member states, which would level the playing field in terms of science capacity, inclusivity and transparency, as well as continuity, since the SAM would not be tied to the limited timeline of the SDGs like many science advice mechanisms at UNGA currently are. A few interviewees noted a handful of disadvantages with this option, mainly integration challenges. With the UN system being decentralized, it may not be feasible to introduce a centralized mechanism. Dependency on member states, with political buy-in from member states required to, in fact, build an institutionalized SAM. It might be more effective to just establish a SAM through member states rather than its own entity. Reduced informal exchange, which is currently central to UNGA's operations. And lastly, a risk to independence, depending on how tightly integrated the SAM is within the UN system. And with these findings, now Benedict will present our recommendations.
So being aware of the huge complexity of the whole system around the UNGA and also the countless efforts of different actors, we formulated a few actionable recommendations, which are also based on our interview data. The first is to actually institutionalize a UNGA science advice mechanism, which would entail specifying a clear mandate, its purpose, a structure, and respective processes. The whole process of evidence provision could also benefit from some guiding principles for evidence integration. These could specify the requirements that are held towards different evidence inputs, but then also the relation between different types of evidence, which go beyond scientific evidence. Then knowledge exchange among member states could be promoted to actually address some of the capacity imbalances between different member states. And here the group of Friends for Science in Action might play an important role. Next, as you saw, there is a diversity of mechanisms around the UNGA, and synergies between these mechanisms could be even enhanced if the amount of lateral networking was increased. A similar thing is true for the representation of external experts. It already exists, but again, increased representation through collaborations with research institutions or also via the existing and well-functioning major groups could be an interesting option. Ultimately, the President of the General Assembly has considerable influence on the proceedings at the UNGA. And so the role of the President could actually be leveraged to bring ambassadors and scientists closer together in exchanges and also to align the scientific briefings with the UNGA agenda. Now back to you, Olivia.
Thanks. So what we take away from our research is that key issues like fragmentation, capacity constraints, and an absence of a standardized procedure to include evidence has so far hindered the UNGA from integrating more of this evidence into its policymaking. But the current use is expandable, and there is growing momentum for an expanded role of evidence in UNGA policymaking, with an institutionalized SAM being the most promising alternative to address these issues. We would like to acknowledge our limitations in this research, including, most importantly, time and resource constraints. But of course, we believe that further research on evidence expansion within the UNGA is definitely a worthwhile topic to continue to investigate. And this includes the role of non-scientific evidence, AI, and the actual policy impact of science advice. But with that, we'd like to thank you for listening to our presentation and hope that it's touched on some interesting topics along the way.
Well, congratulations again with having completed this research with us at STEaPP, and many thanks for your clear presentation. Unfortunately, Her Excellency Ambassador Matu Giorgini couldn't join our webinar in the end due to unforeseen scheduling conflicts. So we will now move to our panel discussion on time, to which I invite the two STEaPP graduates who just presented the research, Ms. McDonald and Mr. Schmidt, as well as Dr. Johannes Kuhlmann, Dr. Doyin Odubanyo, and Dr. Jesse STEaPP. So Dr. Kuhlmann, I will introduce each of them very briefly, is a German water scientist who has worked in development cooperation and research in Brazil and Chile and for German universities. He has supported various international commissions for transboundary water cooperation and presided UNESCO's water program from 2012 to 2014. From 2015 to 2022, Dr. Kuhlmann served as the Senior Director for Water and Climate at the World Meteorological Organization in Geneva. In 2022 and 2023, he supported the President of the UN General Assembly as Chief Scientist in New York and was Vice Chair of UN Water. Since 2024, Dr. Kuhlmann works for the German Federal Water Agency, the Institute for Water Education in Delft, here in the Netherlands. I'm based in The Hague at the moment, and the United Nations University in Dresden, Germany. So thank you for joining the panel, Dr. Kuhlmann. Then Dr. Odubanyo is the Executive Secretary, the Chief Executive of the Nigerian Academy of Science, Since joining the Academy in 2007, he has designed and implemented several strategies to increase the influence of the Academy as a trusted advisor to the government. He is a public health physician with work and management experience across different sectors, including public and private healthcare, government, non-profit, and private enterprises. He was the pioneer chairman of the Africa chapter of the International Network for Government Science Advice, INGSA, which was the first continental chapter of INGSA, is a fellow of the International Science Council, and he sits on the boards of the ISC, the Conversation Africa, and the Leprosy Mission Nigeria, among others. And finally, Dr. Jessica STEaPP is Associate Professor in the School of Geography and Environmental Sciences at the University of Southampton in the UK, and is Deputy Director of Research for WorldPop. At WorldPop, she works to support the development and uptake of high-quality research and methods for the construction of open and high-resolution geospatial data on population distributions, demographics, and dynamics. She has 2 decades of professional experience working in international development within think tanks, charities, the United Nations. From 2014 to 2020, she was a director of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and prior to that, she served as an advisor to the president of Liberia. So with this esteemed panel, let me first put a question to you all, having heard the presentation and taking your own experience into account. Let's start first with Drs. Kuhlmann, Odubanjo, and STEaPP. Could you please provide us with a response to the following question? What, in your mind, would be the role and potential of the different various actors in how to strengthen the use of evidence in UNGA specific decision making? So can I first start with Dr. Kuhlmann, please?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me for this discussion. I think that the study that we have heard, and I'm really impressed about, how well and structured you have come up with a recommendation. And in the end, any mechanism or culture or way of taking more scientific advice or knowledge into account or into decision or negotiation processes depends on the actors. And I think that it is super important that there is a trusted space or broker to organize this. So for me, there is tons of science advice around. It's not that we need new science advice. The question is, how do we make science advice available at the right moment, at the right place, to the right people? And I think we have different opportunities for the UNGA. I think the main question is, can we have a broker? And this could be related to the PGA office. It could also be a separated mechanism that works with member states in New York to formulate the real questions or respond to the real questions when they arise. Because what we traditionally do is we put the information different scientists have in front of decision makers or politicians, and I think that's an error. We need to help them formulate the right questions and then not present them with one answer, but with a Pareto front of transparent possibilities so that they can do something different from what they have done so far. And if we are very honest in the GA, there is a lot of negotiation and interaction that's based on the past, but it's not focused on the future. And if we have reports that always compare where we are with the past, then the science advice is not helping transition. So I think one important aspect is to offer, this Pareto front of possibilities that negotiators can base their arguments or negotiation positions on, that must be collated instantaneously, basically. So we need the mechanism that we're talking about, I think, needs to be first and foremost a process that is qualified through a ready accessibility. And the different actors, for me, it doesn't matter so much which are the actors. It matters more how much trust is put to which actors and how difficult it is to institutionalize, as the study says, this mechanism. And I want to say maybe it is better to live a culture than to institutionalize a process as a starting point. And then maybe a culture can become that conduit for a more science-based decision culture in the UN. But I can talk at length about this because I have a lot of experience, or I have some experience in this regard, but I don't want to go beyond.
We'll circle back to you, but very many thanks for this first set of thoughts, Dr. Kuhlmann. Let's move to Dr. Odubanyo.
Well, let me first say that it must be incredibly complex, trying to govern the world, as it were, in that sense of the UNGA. Incidentally, I mean, the Nigerian Academy just hosted a meeting, an international meeting on how to set up a panel, basically how to set up an advisory mechanism to the UN on antimicrobial resistance. That just happened on the 28th and 29th of April in Lagos. And the thing to see is the complexity of the challenge, how difficult that is. And I think the role for the various actors is to realize that every voice is important. I think for many, it's either you are participating or you just completely shut off from the UN. And feel, look, they're doing their own thing, and we're here doing our own thing. So I think the role, first and foremost, in my mind, is just one word: participate. If you like, call it pressure. Find how the UN works, the UNGA works, and find how you can get your own information through, how you can get your evidence through. I think the moment people sit down a little bit and realize that, look, if I can just study or understudy how this thing works, and I can pass on, what I have to offer as an entity, then we begin to create a movement, as it were. The diversity of the information and the evidence that's provided, I think, is the rich outcome. And that's what results in the kind of outcomes that we want to see, because very often there are voices that are lost. When that doesn't exist, there are lots of voices, and sometimes they carry very good evidence, but they are weak, if you want to call it that. They are low volume voices, but if they make the attempt to participate and put out the information, somebody just might pick it and realize that there's something in that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. STEaPP, over to you.
Hello, thank you so much. First, I need to apologise. As colleagues from UCL know, I'm at a wedding today, but I think this is such an important topic and I'm so passionate about it that I said I would duck out for an hour to join you all. So that's why there's a funny background and some background noise, so I apologise. As the colleagues from UCL know, and the students who've just done such an impressive job, I'm very passionate about this subject. I wrote a book on it year before last, because I just think it's so important. And having worked in New York in the UN system for 7 years with the SDSN, I sort of came away at the end of that thinking everyone expects that the UNGA, as the senior most kind of decision-making body, would have really clear formalized processes. And the truth for anyone who looks under the hood is that it really doesn't. And that it's really quite messy and deeply complex, and no one has the answer. So I think these kinds of events are so important. On the question of what is the role of various actors, I just focused on two sets for now in these quick remarks. The first is for UN entities like UNESCO, the PGA's office, and various other formalized entities within the UN. I think there's a really important role to play with trying to entice scientists and academics to come to New York. Whilst those of us who are interested in multilateral policy think this is the be all and end all, for a lot of academics all around the world, they don't really know why they should bother, why they should use their limited resource budgets to travel, why this is fundamentally so important. And so I think there's a really important point of trying to make these fora more appealing to an academic audience, partnering with nature and science and bringing in academic host institutions to work with the UN to try and stimulate more interest and demand. I think also there's a really important role for UN entities, particularly to support, and great networks like the ISC to support underrepresented epistemic communities. I've got a lot of experience of working in urban science, and I can tell you that the sort of organization of the urban science community versus, for example, public health is just not comparable. It is, quite chaotic. It's the same voices over and over again. And I think we need to call that out and say there are a number of sectors where this long history of investment and the sort of process of developing an epistemic community is not there, and actively support that. And then for member states, I think one of the things that's been touched on, but is hugely important, is trying to be clearer about what the policy priorities are for a given year or GA cycle. I think as an academic, it's incredibly hard to know how to input and when and why. And so having a clearer set of priorities, these are not just broad themes like SDG 1, but very specific questions, to do with oceans or health and different specific subsets of issues on which we're inviting and soliciting specific guidance and advice to respond to a given policy priority. I think those are just some very sort of practical initial suggestions of things that we could do to really try and leverage better science advice within the institutions we've got. Thanks.
So thanks for those three interventions already. I hear an emphasis on we need a culture where there is a demand, but also a supply in the right way. There needs to be ways to have the underrepresented voices heard in an appropriate way. And I have some follow-up questions on those as well. But first, I would like to ask Olivia or Benedict. You can both also pitch in. So which of you would like to, in this kind of first round, reflect on this question?
Well, maybe just to add two little things that came up a few times during the research, which is mainly regarding the supply side, so the people that bring evidence. It's probably almost always helpful if they acknowledge like the complexity of the policymaking process and also the different timelines, and in some sense maybe also the messiness compared to their scientific environments. So they should be aware that science does not really imply specific policy measures, but rather can provide orientation and support the decision-making process in that sense.
Olivia, do you want to add?
Yeah, I can add briefly. I think as everyone has touched on, I don't think necessarily there's, and at least from the research and the responses that we got from interviewees, I think people on both sides are very eager to improve the system. And that was well communicated, and still is with the developments going on at the UN and its continued measures to increase science capacity and integration. But of course, the onus needs to be taken by somebody. And I believe, coming back to the research, that knowledge brokers have such a key role in connecting the right people to the right evidence at the right time. But I have to say the responses so far have touched on the more intelligent points. But to emphasize that there's a broad and general kind of supportive environment, and it's just about, I think, as Dr. Coleman was touching on, not necessarily being stuck in repeated patterns or historical ways of doing things, but taking a nod to the spirit of science and research and taking an initial step to try something. Yeah, that's what I have to add on that question.
So I propose we try to dig a little bit deeper on this question of the culture and also what's then a right balance between formal and institutionalized ways to do science advice and more informal ways. And I think, Johannes, you already alluded to that. You were warning against institutionalization and you were pleading for culture. So maybe you can take the opportunity and dig a little bit deeper on that question on the balance between the formal ways and the informal ways.
Yeah, why did I give a little warning here is if you imagine we would want to negotiate in New York a science advisory mechanism to be adopted in the GA to inform all the processes, we'd negotiate for 30 years or longer. So, you know, this is not the way we can bring that about. But what I think must be in some way formal is a trusted, neutral, objective broker system or platform where we can bring all the information, where everybody can bring their own information, where everybody can understand what are those different Pareto possibilities for solutions, and where people can use that together and evaluate it also together. And maybe AI is one part of it. We have, of course, the discussion if ChatGPT or DeepSeek is better or more secure or what, but a transparent way to evaluate, to apport to the discussion, to evaluate this information and to go into discussions, and also to fix once established, say, agreements or knowledge. And the IPCC is such a process, but it's super long, super costly, and of course, way too heavy to address all the development issues that we're dealing with in the UN. So that mechanism must be, I think, in some way formal, because otherwise it can't be trusted. But then the process, how this can be used, I think, must have a lot of informal aspects to it, because that's where the people learn to cooperate, learn to trust each other, and go into a routine of using that system. So I mean, I have also had very positive experiences in the GA around parts of what we are offering to people. So when member states see that it brings a benefit, then they will use it. And for me, that aspect of brokering that, bringing all the information into a platform, in an evaluation system, and a knowledge repository, so that we don't have to restart all the discussions when new people come in, or a different angle of us. We had so many different negotiation processes around health, and one is about hospitals, and the other one about vaccines, and the third one about whatnot. It's all about health. So why do we have different processes with different information? It makes no sense. So that's the formal aspect, and the informal is the culture to use it.
Thank you for that. Doyen, can I ask you to answer the question on the balance between formal and informal pathways?
I think the real challenge is setting up the formal. The informal kind of sorts itself out organically. I think you can't orchestrate the informal, as it were. So it's what you do with the formal system. And I agree with Joanne, and his comments about the fact that you need to have a place where the evidence can be cooked, not cooked in the sense of formed, but where you can kind of mix all the ingredients, analyze, and bring them forward, for use. And I think that, demands an independent, some form of independence from the UN system itself. So it has to be some independent system or institution that is credible as well for doing such work, that's accessible to the general community, both policy making and scientific community. They have access to it. There's transparency in the processes that are used to generate the advice that is generated. And of course, that also will speak a bit to its funding. How do you fund such a system? Because funding sometimes can compromise that kind of independence or transparency. But basically, the idea is that the emphasis should be on creating a formal system that works, and the informal will find its own level organically. Thank you.
Thank you. Jessica.
Thanks very much. I think I would say that whilst there are many challenges, as Johannes knows particularly well, having worked with Ambassador Kusaba Kurosi before, when he was president of the General Assembly. There are a lot of challenges with trying to institutionalize a mechanism, but I do feel a bit more optimistic about the potential to leverage existing mechanisms. That the Office of the President of the General Assembly has a lot of authority and influence, and if we could create more of an expectation that the PGA will always have science panels and will always set proceedings like Ambassador Kurosi did of bringing scientists regularly into the GA, that could become much more of an institutional norm, I think, than we've seen in the last 2 PGA administrations. The other thing that I feel very optimistic about is that we do have some other smaller mechanisms like the Committee on Development Policy. We saw a lot of innovation during the SDG negotiations with the use of the Open Working Group. So there have been pockets of kind of innovation where we've seen scientists really being brought into these proceedings that we could leverage and use, I think, more effectively. I think the other thing I'd say related to the sort of supporting informal mechanisms is the importance of investing in regional science capacity and advice. I'm doing a lot of work at the moment with the African Regional Economic Commissions on trying to strengthen that capacity at the regional level, specifically because I think there's a growing recognition of the fact that, much like we now recognize in the policy science literature, you can't be really binary with scales. The international level and the national level, the regional level are all incredibly related, and scientists and policymakers move between these scales frequently. So if we were to strengthen processes at the regional level, I think that will also have a very positive knock-on effect for how things happen at the GA, and also give different countries and constituencies more of a chance to sort of use science to influence their regional positions before coming to New York, which frankly is, when it's a bit late in the day because you're right in the sort of the final stages of negotiation. So I think there's a lot that could be done to leverage existing platforms. Thanks.
Thanks. Again, opportunity for Benedict and Olivia to pitch in if you want. Not for Benedict, Olivia?
I guess I just would like to compliment all of the answers that were given so far, particularly Dr. Odubanyo's response and that analogy of the organic growth of informal pathways, at least from what I understood looking at this research and understanding it through this project, is that the informal pathways that play such a crucial role currently in UNGA operations kind of grew out of a need to connect people to provide evidence in the absence of something a bit more standardized. But to touch on what Dr. Espy said, there is definitely precedent of these channels being set up and being utilized in an efficient and effective way. So I certainly believe that there is a reasonable, and it's achievable to get a balance between formal and informal pathways, and I think that they work synergistically. Yeah.
Apologies, I had a network connection issue. I have a next question for the panel, which is, hearing everything, how can the inclusiveness of evidence be enhanced? So it was already raised that plurality is so important and weak voices are so important, but do you have specific advice within particular ways these formal structures may be set up, such as a new UN science advice mechanism, or with how you want to connect national, regional, and international levels? Do you have ideas on how you can increase the inclusiveness of evidence that's considered? Can I go to Johannes first again?
Yeah, I think inclusiveness comes through transparency first, and so we need to be more transparent. Many publications or pieces of science advice are produced by certain types of scientific communities, and that must be visible and clear, and from there we can start to support the science networks that Jessica has mentioned. I mean, the UN Foundation is working on that. There's lots of actors who try to empower these people and to bring their voices to the mechanism. Not we always talk about we have to bring the voices to the table. I think that's wrong. We need to integrate science at the global level so that we have more mixed teams of different scientists from different places to work together. And it's not for me to have one study from Europe on taxes or tariffs and one from Africa and one from Asia. We should have integrated regional and global science networks and teams to work on these questions. I think that would be the one. If you would give me $100 million to do that, I'd only fund global transcontinental research teams on different topics.
Thanks for that. Doyen.
Following on Dr. Kuhlmann's talk, I think it's just about being deliberate to find, the evidence from the diversity of evidence that we need. The scientists exist, the institutions exist everywhere. And if we were deliberate to look for them, to get the answers, to charge them with providing the evidence we want, and to contribute their own, quota to the evidence pot, we will get it. So I think it's just about being deliberate to find the evidence, and once we do that, we're able to enhance the diversity of the evidence we work with. There are organizations. There's a lot of integration across board, regionally, sub-regionally. There are all kinds of institutions that can reach the people that can, mine the evidence required from the right sources and provide them for use. And we just have to be deliberate in charging them to do so and ensuring that we are not moving forward except we get the evidence from everyone that we require. Thank you.
Thank you. Jessica.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd second everything that's been said by Dr. Kuhlmann and Dr. Doyen. I think, as I already alluded to, there's huge capacity in regions all around the world. And what I think we just need to do, as was just being said, is be much more deliberate in how we solicit and invite that evidence in, how we support regional mechanisms to engage with these processes and so on. One thing I would add to this, though, and this is a bit of a personal bugbear and maybe slightly related, but perhaps a bit off topic, is that we need to be a lot clearer about what we mean by evidence. And whilst a tight definition is impossible, I think it would be very helpful in the context of the UN General Assembly to have a bit more of a taxonomy of the different types of evidence that we're talking about. They're all welcome and they should all be invited and they should all be around the table. But having kind of codified knowledge in reports that's come from longitudinal studies or multi-country studies is very different from having tacit knowledge coming from a representative from UNHCR who's giving you a testimony on a conflict, right? Versus statistical knowledge coming from the statistical systems and being presented following the UN Stats Commission. And I think there's a bit of a tendency at the moment in many corridors of kind of UN debate and UNGA debate specifically to conflate evidence inputs and to assume that, something that's coming out of the IPCC should be given the same weight as a report that's coming out of the WRI. And I don't think that that's appropriate. And I think it needs to be, it's all welcome, but we need a much clearer system of what we're talking about when we talk about evidence. Also, so that we can then identify the gaps. If we are missing practitioner networks from around the world, or if we are missing scientists from certain parts of the global south, particularly, that would be a lot more obvious if we were clear about the kinds of inputs that we're receiving. So that's a bit of a sort of personal issue, personal thing I want to raise, perhaps not entirely responding to your question, but hopefully still relevant.
Thanks very much. So let's move to some of the questions that we have been receiving in the chat, and please keep adding questions there. So just picking randomly from those questions. There's one from Alessandro Allegra, and maybe Benedict or Olivia can take it on because it's about what you learned from the interviews. He's stating that institutionalization requires resources, human resources, financial resources, political resources. And has that aspect emerged from the interviews and hasn't been mapped in your study? So who of the two of you can respond? Benedict.
Yes, I'm happy to say a few words about that. So it's definitely an important point, and it might be one of the challenges also regarding institutionalization. What came up during the interviews was the role model of the IPCC, and the whole formalized IPCC is around $8 million a year, and this is based partly on contributions from its parent organizations, but then also funded by voluntary contributions from member state governments. And so in that sense, we can see that it might be not even as expensive as we expect to have this kind of evidence provision mechanism. And it probably, according to the interviews that we had, most realistic to count on voluntary contributions ultimately. But of course, this could then raise a few questions about the independence of the mechanism, and that should be considered. But if there is no alternative, then this might be the best way to go. And we didn't reveal other ideas through the interviews on that question.
So final question, let me pick that for all the panelists to give their final reflections in each 45 seconds each, which is from Gabriela Fierro and also Fat Ali Ahmed. Abdul Wahab Al-Fatesh came with this question on the role of education at bachelor's, master's and PhD level on science advice and science diplomacy. And of course, we in our institution have been working on that, but this is not so much about us. This is really about the system as a whole, the education system, and anywhere in the world. Do you think that there needs to be more institutionalized courses that focus on science advice and science diplomacy? Let me start with Johannes.
That's a very tricky question, because you can make science advice an own curriculum or science or function, which I don't think it should be. I think what we need to do is have scientists more aware of what is needed and invest in this broker function or broker quality of all the scientists. So I am actually not very convinced that investing more money in educating more specific science policy experts will resolve the problem. That's my spontaneous reaction. I think we should invest in all the scientists so that they come together in networks and understand how they can provide these Pareto front type possibilities for decision makers to make a decision. And just in 1 minute, when I started working for the German government, I had a senior person in the Foreign Office, and he asked me, I was his water advisor, he asked me what to do in this context, and I said, do that. And he said, well, if you tell me what to do, then I will question your science. You should tell me what my possibilities are, because I'm a politician and my prerogative is to find the solution. Your role is to give me different possibilities. And I think that's what we don't understand yet.
Thanks for that. Good advice. Doyen.
I think trying to teach the art of science advice and make that a master's or PhD is quite challenging. I think for the generality of people, what we need is that kind of shorter modular exposure, to what it is, what is required, what is expected, how it works, and so on. And then you have a smaller crop of elite group to research it and keep researching it. So it's yes and no. You need the masters and PhDs for few people, but you need most of the scientists knowing and learning the art of science advice. Thank you.
Jessica, very briefly.
Sure. I think I fall somewhere in the middle. I think it's really important that actually in many mainstream scientific, hard, soft, whatever scientific courses they may be, that there's much more meaningful engagement with policy influencing, right? That obviously we should all be trying to become specialists in our respective areas, but within those respective areas, really understanding how you communicate results, how you engage with policymakers, what the opportunities are at local, regional, national scales to affect change on a broader level is hugely important. So I see this as a really important field, but perhaps one that needs to be a little bit more horizontally integrated across other dimensions. And maybe that is the key role for those people who are coming out with this, wonderful degrees in science policy, as per your great department, is to actually sort of help institutionalize this across domains. So yes, that would be my quick response. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I would now like to conclude this webinar. I do recommend all attendees to download the report and read it. It's worth it. And to conclude, let me really thank all the speakers for their insights that they were willing to share, for your participation, and the International Science Council for working with us at STEaPP to make first the research itself realizable, and now making this webinar happen. So thank you all very much and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Yeah, cool work. Thanks a lot.